You may recall that at the beginning of the semester we talked about dialectical theory and how it applies to intercultural communication. Remember that dialectics concern the simultaneous tensions between two opposing forces. For example, we might be in a relationship where we simultaneously want things to be predictable and interesting and new. When things in a relationship are predictable, it's great, right? There isn't any drama, you know what to expect from the other person. Generally speaking, when things are predictable, that means things are going well. There's nothing too exciting to pull us out of our normal routine. While we like things predictable, we also crave things in those relationships to be new and to be exciting so that we can have different and interesting experiences. So sometimes when things get too predictable in a relationship, we worry about what we might be missing out on. So is there something better out there? Is there something novel, new, and exciting, or a person who's novel, new, and exciting waiting for us? Thus, in any of our relationships, we simultaneously feel this push and pull between wanting things to be predictable and wanting things to be interesting or wanting things to be novel. Earlier this semester, we talked about some dialectics that are important to intercultural communication. And so we're going to go through a couple of those dialectics today as we talk about intercultural relationships. In intercultural relationships, we feel a pull between the personal and the contextual. So by personal, we note that there are aspects of our relationships that tend to be very, very personal. So the way we respond to different things that happen within our relationships is consistent from one situation to the next. So that's our personal preference for how we would respond to stimuli. While we have these personal preferences, there are also situations where context is really important to the development and maintenance of an intercultural relationship. So if you look at Tula and Ian in My Big Fat Greek Wedding, Tula falls in love with a person who doesn't share the same religious and cultural background as her. So their relationship is an intercultural one. The whole movie shows how these different intercultural encounters are happening and how they can be both comedic and they can be heartbreaking. And so we keep seeing these clashes of the cultures in this movie. So knowing that these two have an intercultural relationship, you can see this personal and contextual dimension or dialectic at play in how the two start dating. So Tula has a very personal, so very unique to her, way of interacting that we see at the beginning of the movie. So she isn't as fancy in how she looks as she waits tables in her dad's restaurant. But when she decides to go back to school, she changes her style. So she changes the clothes that she wears, the way she does her hair, the makeup that she wears, things like that. So in the context of the old Tula, Tula would have blindly done things to help her family and to help her father. And then in the context of the new Tula, she seeks out the things that she wants and is willing to fight for a relationship with Ian because the context has changed. So in her personal history, she might be very unlikely to go against what her father says, very unlikely to do something that opposes his wishes. But the context in her life, so the way that the personal transformation that she's made, makes it so that the context is what wins out in the movie, at least. Similarly, it's important to know that the number one predictor of whether or not we personally engage in intercultural relationships is the diversity within our social circles. So context is important in understanding how and why we're willing or unwilling to interact with diverse others. Note how this might make things a little difficult for people at UWEC. We've recently had some campus-wide events that were focused on raising awareness about diversity issues on campus. So if we know that we're more apt to interact with people that are culturally similar to ourselves, and that we only really seek out those culturally different relationships when we're in a context where there's a lot of diversity, we might recognize that some of the struggles that individuals from diverse backgrounds experience on the UWEC campus come from the fact that the vast majority of the campus looks very similar, right? So the vast majority of our campus is very white. And so with this lack of diversity on campus, it doesn't necessarily enable white students to be sympathetic to the issues faced by students of diverse backgrounds because they have a lot of individuals they can choose from when they're picking friends. So when we pick friends, well, as we'll get to in a second, we tend to pick people who are more similar to ourselves. And so if you have a lot of similar others to choose from, you're less likely to seek out diverse others when forming relationships. And so as a member of that larger group, then you have far more opportunities to interact with people than people of the smaller minorities have to interact. So that's one of the issues we face on campus. So it's important to be aware of that as we think of how we're going to confront some of these diversity issues that we have in the future, just so that we recognize that we have this preference for finding people and for picking people who are similar to ourselves, unless we find ourselves in contexts where there's a lot of diversity. So personally, we tend to prefer people who are similar to us unless our context has a lot of diversity. So recognizing that our context doesn't have a lot of diversity, we have to think of ways that we can challenge our thinking as individuals so that we can find more meaningful connections with all the people on campus, rather than just the people on campus who are similar to ourselves. So in the last example, we talked about differences and similarities, and that's a separate dialectic. There's places where these dialectics are similar, and that's okay. None of them are mutually exclusive. But when we look at differences and similarities, we want to start out by looking at the similarity principle, which states that individuals tend to be attracted to people that they perceive to be similar to themselves. We do this because of something called cognitive consistency, which is having logical connections between existing knowledge and new stimuli. So we like ourselves. We think that the things that we like are all pretty cool. So if other people happen to like those things too, then those individuals have to be cool. And that's kind of how our thinking goes. So when people like the same things we like them. And when people don't like the things that we like, we question them, or we don't know how we feel about them, or whether or not we want to have that relationship with that person. So this is the logic that enables us to find connections with other people. This cognitive consistency means I don't have to stretch my mind too much to think of how I would interact with this other person. How would our relationship work? So when we perceive consistency, we're employing that similarity principle, and we seek out connections with people who are similar. On the differences end of the dialectic, it notes that we might also find people who are complementary to us. So these individuals who seek out others based on this complementarity principle are attracted to people who are different from themselves because they perceive that those differences help to balance out the relationship. So I like cooking, but I don't like doing the dishes. My husband likes doing the dishes, but doesn't like cooking. That's a complementary relationship, right? Where one of us lacks something, the other person is able to make up for it, which makes our relationship work better. Our house stays clean and we stay fed because we each prefer to do the other thing and are willing to do the other thing within our relationship. So when we talk about complementarity, we appreciate the fact that the other person brings something to the relationship that we lack. So taking it all back to that original image, when I think of the similarity principle, I think of a high school lunchroom. So I went to a really big high school in St. Paul, Minnesota, and there were many diverse groups that were very well represented within the school. Whenever we go to lunch, it was clearly visible that these groups tended to eat together. Right, so there wasn't a lot of blending in how friendship groups coordinated among people from different cultural backgrounds. So again, this reminds us that a lot of times we form relationships with people who look similar to us because we perceive that they're going to like the things that we will like, right? That we have that. We don't have to stretch too far in our thinking to see ourselves connected with those people. Again, this is a reminder that this idea makes things difficult for minority students on our campus. So UWEC is over 90% white. So if we tend to seek out those people who are similar to us as relational partners, we might not look to interact with diverse others if we see enough people who look like us who are willing to be our friends or willing to be dating partners. That doesn't mean that there's anything bad with having friends who are white or who are similar to you, same race as you. It just reminds us that that tends to be what we have this preference for doing, seeking out people who are similar to ourselves. So it helps us remember that there are advantages to finding diverse others and finding people who complement us. And so perhaps that's a reminder when beginning new relationships with people to look beyond just the individuals who are similar to us, which might be what our more personal way of doing things are, so that thing that we don't have to think about, just kind of the way things tend to be. We also talked about a cultural and an individual dialectic, and this reminds us that culture dictates what we say and we do just as much as our individual choices do. So we know things about how women and girls ought to behave in our society because of rules that are placed on us. So cultural norms say that women ought to want to find someone to be with, so find a husband, listen to their husbands, care for their husbands, cook their husbands' meals, clean the house, do their husband's laundry, things like that. So women in our culture tend to be expected to do things for their husbands as part of what it means to be a woman. So that doesn't mean that women are supposed to be completely submissive to their husbands. That's not necessarily the case, but it's more the idea that our culture sanctions this idea that women are supposed to want to provide care for their husbands, and while at the same time being very independent women who can make their own choices, but they should want to take care of the men that they're with. That's kind of how our culture looks at things, but we do know that that's not true for all women in our culture. So just remember that when we talk about these differences, we're painting these pictures about what the whole culture looks like, recognizing that not everyone in the culture happens to be that way. So I kind of thought of the movie Frozen as I was thinking about this one. So Anna in the movie wants to find a man. She's ready to marry the first guy who looks her way. And she's what I think of when I see like cultural expectations of femininity. You should want to be with a guy. You should want to have someone in your life to take care of and to help care for you. And that's kind of what it means to be a woman, is finding that person. Do note that guys are expected to find someone to care for as well, so it's not like this is unique to women wanting to find someone to bond with. In the movie, however, Elsa, especially after her transformation and the empowerment that she feels because of that transformation, is more apt to rely on her individuality. So she doesn't care what other people think she ought to do. She's willing to change the rules for what's acceptable and be her own person. So in the movie, she has no real love interest. She's kind of on her own. Do note how much easier it is for Elsa because of the position of power that she has. So in the movie, she's the queen. Anna is the little sister, so she will only become like the ruler if her sister passes away, right? So just do note that power makes it a lot easier to be an individual. So it's easier to challenge societal expectations and societal norms when you're in a position of power, because you have that voice to speak out against those norms, and you have that voice to say that I want to look at things or do things differently. The privilege-disadvantage dialectic reminds us that there are power differentials in our relationships, and at times we're going to feel a pull between our privileged and our disadvantaged identities. So imagine you have a best friend who's of Mexican descent, and her family only speaks Spanish at home. So in your home country, the United States, you're considered probably the more privileged individual, as you are a white individual in this example at least, and your family has quite a bit of money. So you come from a background that makes you be privileged within this context. You have access to different opportunities that your friend might not have because of her different racial background. So the two of you decide that you're going to study abroad in Spain. And in Spain, your friend might have a more privileged identity than you do because she's able to speak Spanish fluently and you can't. So as you're going around the town, she's able to interact with people. She's able to order things at restaurants, find out where to go, find out the best things to look for and best sights to see, because she's able to speak the language and you can't. So that reminds us that we can simultaneously have both privileged and disadvantaged identities. So you can be white, which is going to be a privileged identity. You can have money, which is a privileged identity, but you might not be able to speak the language in the place that you are in, so you're going to be disadvantaged in that respect. That being said, when we're trying to be good intercultural communicators, we have to take the opportunity to be sensitive to others and speak on their behalf when we can. So when we find ourselves with a privileged identity, we want to make sure we're looking out for those individuals who have disadvantaged identities. So this was the argument with that Macklemore piece that I had you read for a few discussions back. So the issue in that piece wasn't that Macklemore won the Grammy when he shouldn't have. It's that Macklemore writes a lot of songs and he makes money off of talking about social issues and social problems. So he uses his voice to raise awareness to particular social issues like same-sex marriage rights. So we know that he's sensitive to the plight of disadvantaged individuals, and he wants to work to help those individuals. And the problem that this woman and a lot of people had with what he did is that he had the opportunity with his privileged voice to stand up and say something at the Grammys about the fact that he thought Kendrick Lamar deserved the award over him, and he didn't. And so he had that opportunity to use his privilege and to use his voice to make a point, and he didn't take that opportunity. Instead, he sent a private message. And so what this privileged disadvantaged dialectic can remind us of in intercultural relationships is that when we're lucky enough to find ourselves with a privileged identity, we do have this duty to help all those individuals who are disadvantaged and to help them find a voice or give them a voice if we can. The static dynamic dialectic reminds us that relationships are always changing. So intercultural relationships, they're no different. If we interact with people, we start sharing experiences, and as we share experiences, our worldviews begin to change as we start accounting for the presence of the other person. Thus, it's important to note that intercultural differences might lessen as an intercultural relationship develops or deepens. This is because we create that third culture as we interact interculturally with others. That third culture comes out of those shared experiences. So while some things seem to be enduring, relationships and the people in them are constantly changing, and that's just part of life. So things are simultaneously static, and we think that they're consistent, but they're also always changing. The final dialectic to pay attention to is the history, past, present, future dialectic, which reminds us of how important context is to understanding what's happening in our intercultural relationships. So a few years ago, Jay-Z and Beyonce went to Cuba. And there was a big uproar because usually people from the U.S. don't get to go to Cuba because of a strained political relationships. There are historical reasons why that relationship is strained, right? And so this dialectic reminds us that it's important to consider the history and the past when we're looking at the intercultural relationships that we're part of, because the history between different groups of people and the history that certain groups of people have experienced, those interculturally different people have experienced, even if it wasn't at the hands of someone from your culture, or it's going to change how they look at relationships and how they opt to interact with anyone. So understanding history is always important. So as we look at intercultural relationships, it's important to consider the ways that dialectical tensions are at play. They remind us that we always feel these pushes and pulls between competing forces in our lives. This can be good when we recognize the tensions at play and work to favor the ends of the dialectic that enable us to more easily connect with intercultural others.